he has visited, spoken to, and negotiated democracy, good governance, and human rights advancements in almost all African countries. So let us listen to this program and enjoy the conversation with Dr. Christopher Fomunyoh.
Thank you for having me. It's such a pleasure to be on your platform and to contribute to the conversations about our continent, its past, its present, and its future.
Thank you so much for accepting to come. I know you've been very busy over the last 2 or 3 months. I've been running after you, and work has been calling you from one continent to the other, from one part of the United States to the other. And finally, here we are. And we are talking about Africa, a continent you hold so dear to your heart. Can you just tell us a little bit about why you love this continent so much?
First, it's my continent of birth. It's also the continent from which I would like to say humanity originated. It is the continent of 1.4 billion people. It's projected that in the next 20 or 30 years, Africa will contribute to 25% of the world's population. It's a continent that's rich in mineral resources and human capital. It's a continent that has so much to offer and to which many of us hold very dearly. Interestingly, also, it's a continent that for various reasons at various points in the history of mankind, it's had its sons and daughters scattered all over the world. We are the only race, human race, that's got a diaspora that's found on every continent on the surface of the earth. So Africa, for me, is unique, and it has a pivotal role to play in the future of the globe. And that's why I feel very passionate about it, because I see the challenges, but I also see a lot of opportunities.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chris. Ladies and gentlemen, you're on Beyond Africa, and on Beyond Africa, we explore how Africa's diaspora can contribute in transforming the continent. And Beyond Africa considers Africans at home and abroad as the key catalyst to the transformation of the continent. And Dr. Chris, you've just said that you are so passionate about this continent. And when we look at most people who've traveled out of the continent, it appears they don't care much about the continent and its transformation. Do you share that view that Africans who are abroad do not think or do not work hard towards the transformation of the continent?
No, I do not share that view. I can understand the hard feelings that have driven many Africans, especially the Africans of our generation, of our times, who are moving out of the continent, not because they're forced, as was the case with those that crossed the continent in ships because of the slave trade at the time. The Africans of today are leaving their continent, some to pursue education and to acquire new skills, others because the circumstances within their respective countries make it extremely difficult for them to make a contribution, and they therefore feel the need to go out and seek for greener pastures. But I can also tell you that deep down to a person, each one of those Africans is attached to the homeland. Each one of those Africans, if given the opportunity, would strive to make a difference, to make their countries or the continent a better place. And this is very proven. For example, in very concrete terms, when you look at the financial remittances that Africans send to the continent on a yearly basis, and this is documented by the World Bank in its multiple reports on migration and development. For 2023 alone, the remittances of Africans towards the continent or into the continent accounted for $100 billion US. 100 billion US dollars is more than all of overall development assistance that Africa receives from developed countries. It's more than the private investment combined that the continent receives. So the diaspora alone is a key constituency that's contributing to the development of the continent. And that's only coming about because Africans in the diaspora hold very dearly to the well-being of the continent and to its future. I would also say, even historically and politically, when you think about the pro-independence movements across the continent, you will come to the realization that many Africans at the time, in the 50s and in the 60s, some of whom were serving in European institutions, such as Seda Senghor of Senegal or Fomunyoh of Cote d'Ivoire, others who were studying in the United States, such as Nnamdi Ezekwe of Nigeria, and many others were already advocating. They were joining their brothers and sisters on their continent to advocate for independence of the continent. And many of them made such strong contributions because they believed in the continent. And I think that thread still flows, that blood still flows in our veins. And I think that if the opportunities were to arise, that every African that's in the diaspora would find a way either to relocate or to make a meaningful contribution to the development of their country and the continent as a whole.
Thank you. That is brilliantly put. And Beyond Africa understands that Africans who are abroad are physically abroad, but spiritually at home, because they want to contribute to make home a better place. And the mantra of Beyond Africa is provide a platform for people, for Africans, the friends of Africa, to talk about transforming their continent. So this is that platform where we invite everybody who has an idea and wants to transform the continent to do so. As you rightly said, our predecessors worked for the political independence of the continent from colonization. It is therefore our responsibility to work towards the economic and financial independence of Africa. We can do that. We have the resources, we have the networks, we have the intelligence, and of course, there is the money to put together and see how to transform the continent. If we could reorientate the remittances you just mentioned in another way that could spike transformation, processing, industrial transformation and processing back on the continent, I think the continent can transform because we need to generate that income on the continent. And one last word on this, I understand you are going to be speaking at a conference known as Rebranding Africa. Could you tell us more about that?
Indeed, I will. And before talking about the rebranding conference that's coming up in Brussels in the next 10 days or so, let me just add to your point to say that another statistic that's out there that your listeners need to know or your viewers need to know is that the totality of the African diaspora is 350 million people. And I'm talking about the diaspora of all generations, but that identify with the African continent is 350 million people, which means that if it were a country of its own, it would be surpassed in population only by India and China. It would be way ahead of the population of the United States. That's very powerful. And so if you look at it in terms of expertise, economic empowerment, and you tell yourself that this constituency is putting $100 billion into the continent annually, you then ask yourself, shouldn't it be natural that if they were shareholders in a company and they were putting $100 billion US into that company every year, wouldn't it be natural that they also have a say in how that company is run or governed? And that's, the message that I would love for the diaspora to take to heart, that I would also love for our leaders on the continent to take to heart, because they have to create that enabling environment in which the African diaspora can feel comfortable enough to want to invest and have a permanent stake in the well-being of the continent and their respective countries. Interestingly, in just about 10 days, a number of us will be meeting in Brussels, Belgium, at the invitation of Mr. Thierry Hord, who is a Cameroonian, who has organized an initiative, who 10 years ago launched an initiative called Rebranding Africa Forum, because he got the sense that the continent was not being well branded on the global stage. and that it was important to create a platform that would stimulate conversations amongst African experts, not only to showcase their expertise, but also to be part of that conversation about the continent. And that if the continent was being discussed by African voices through African visions, then the rest of the world will be obliged to listen, and we could then impart how the continent is branded, how the continent is viewed, how the continent's opportunities are acknowledged, even while we discuss the challenges and how to deal with them. So I really look forward to this fascinating conference that's coming up in Brussels. And you could see from the invitation that a whole range of experts are being invited from the economic sector, from the healthcare sector, investors, private investors, even leaders from the continent, including entrepreneurs, heads of states, and heads of governments as well.
That is promising to be an interesting event, and would like to encourage Thierry and his team, and maybe have them here to talk about what they are putting together, so that most everybody would become aware of what they are doing for the continent. Thank you so much, and this sounds like an area that we need to explore more and talk about, because it looks like you have a lot of ideas, and you've been doing so much already on the continent, in Cameroon, Prayer Foundation, and other initiatives. So we need to talk about what we are doing and what others are doing to put the spotlight on Africans who are actually striving to change the continent. So we learn from the difficulties they're having, and the proposals. Maybe they will learn from others and see how to ameliorate the situation.
Indeed. And the beauty of today's communication platforms is that a lot can be done virtually. And that while the conference is taking place in Brussels, they also do acknowledge that the bulk of the African diaspora is based in the United States. It's very active, it's very dynamic, and that they could also be very active participants in that conversation, which is scheduled for October 17th through the 19th. Interestingly, just 2 weeks ago, I was invited by the Ivory Club of Tampa in Florida State, which is an organization of African experts in the diaspora that meet annually to find ways in which they can contribute to the development of the continent, while at the same time also making contributions to the African diaspora in the United States. I was invited as a keynote speaker at their conference, and I was amazed just by how many African diasporas there are, even in a city like Tampa, Florida, and how much they each to a person are committed in finding ways to bring their expertise to bear in the development of the continent. And I would say that the countries and the leaders that already recognize this talent pool, this pool of expertise, and that can tap into it, are well placed to contribute to the development of their country. And one example that comes to mind before we move on from this subject is that Jerry Rawlings in Ghana, it's a very concrete example. When Jerry Rawlings was president in Ghana, he decided that Ghana was going to open its doors to all African diaspora. And the message coming out of Ghana was that every member of the African diaspora who wanted to relocate to Ghana would be given Ghanaian nationality and would be given facilities to be able to invest in Ghana. And once that decision was taken, many Africans in the diaspora, including here in the United States, actually relocated in Ghana. Many of them constructed residences in Ghana. Many of them opened businesses. And that was a real boost to the economic development of Ghana. And you can see that today, Accra has become a major international airport. There are international flights from almost all European cities and 2 or 3 U.S. cities, Atlanta, New York, Washington, D.C., direct flights into Accra. And sometimes you have to get up early and book well in advance to have a seat. Because Jerry Rawlings and his government and the people of Ghana saw what they could gain from embracing the diaspora. They embraced it intelligently, created an enabling environment, and the diaspora responded. I understand that Benin Republic is now thinking through similar legislation that would also try to attract the diaspora in the Caribbean and in Latin American countries, many of whom trace their origins to Benin Republic. And so that thinking is changing. If the thinking about the importance, the capital role of the diaspora, the importance of the diaspora is changing, even right on the continent itself, and I think it's changing for good.
That is amazing. May the soul of J.J. Rawlings rest in peace. In addition to this piece of magnificent legislation and policy, he also revolutionized democracy in Ghana and actually handed over power after his second mandate freely and lives in the country like any ordinary citizen. And that is something that most Africans should actually admire and remember J.J. Rawlings for. And talking about J.J. Rawlings handing over power, let us switch now to talk about politics. Let us look at the American politics, which you've been in the middle of it over the years. And I have received former United States ambassadors on this platform, Ambassador Thibonage and Ambassador David Shin. Both of them have said that Africa does not appear significantly on the American foreign policy thoughts when candidates are discussing American foreign policy. Very few of them think about Africa. But you are one of those who have been in the United States for long, and you have accompanied United States governments, both Republican governments and Democratic governments, to carry democracy of the continent forward. Do you think that in the absence of considering Africa as a key player in American foreign policy, Africa should actually pay attention to the American elections as it is ongoing?
Well, I have been very fortunate all these years to work for the National Democratic Institute, which is a non-profit, non-governmental organization that works to support and strengthen democracy worldwide. And because we're non-partisan and we're non-governmental, we receive support, bipartisan support from the U.S. Congress, and our activities are conducted irrespective of the administration that occupies the White House. And so whether it's a Democratic or Republican administration, they've always been supportive of our activities and have allowed us the leeway to conduct our activities the way that we're mandated through the Act of Congress that created the National Endowment for Democracy, and therefore, and through the National Endowment for Democracy, the 4 core institutes, one of which is the National Democratic Institute. I also know very well the 2 ambassadors that you referenced, you cross-referenced, Ambassador Thibonage, who was former Assistant Secretary for African Affairs, and Ambassador Shin, who served as U.S. Ambassador in many countries on the African continent. And those 2 gentlemen epitomize the bulk of former U.S. policymakers who have worked on the African continent, who know the potential that the continent has, who know and understand the opportunities that exist on that continent, and who regret the fact that they would wish that Africa was prominent, was a priority for incoming U.S. administrations, especially during the campaign season. I share their concerns, but I also understand that oftentimes, as we see with most U.S. elections, the elections tend to be driven by domestic issues, domestic concerns, and that foreign policy scarcely features during the campaign season. And even when it features, sometimes it's overshadowed by the major crisis of the day. What's happening between Russia and Ukraine, or what's happening in the Middle East. And then when Africa is mentioned, it has to be maybe the major conflict that we see today in Sudan. But the key issue that all of us Africans in the diaspora should focus on is what happens when an administration has been elected and is now in office, or when members of Congress have been elected and are now sitting in Congress. How can we engage with them to make sure that at that point, whether Africa was discussed during the campaign or not, But once the administration is in place and Congress is back in session, how can these two institutions that are really key with regards in terms of U.S. policy, how can these two institutions prioritize U.S. relations with Africa in a way that allow the African people to feel that their issues are being addressed and that they and their countries are being treated in a manner that's respectful and deserving, and that allows the Africans who believe in democratic governance to be able to participate actively in the positive administration of their respective countries. Fortunately, thus far, democracy has been seen as embraced in a bipartisan manner. And when I look back over the years and over my time working for the Institute, I'm happy to say that the work that we've done on the African continent has received support from both sides. And my hope is that once the elections are over in November, whichever party or candidate wins those elections, that organizations working on the continent would continue to receive the support that they need to be able to partner with African Democrats to make sure that democracy can be consolidated and actually practiced across our continent.
Yeah, thank you so much. One thing that we look at when we do our analysis of the African continent I'm sorry about that. One thing that we look at when we do the analysis of the African continent is the impact of American diplomacy towards the continent of Africa. Most people or most critics along the streets of Africa, or even on some media houses, are of the opinion that American foreign policy or Western foreign policy is a cultural play. The democracy and of the human rights that the West preaches is not necessarily what they are looking for. They say they're just trying to change the continent of Africa to follow Western dictates and maybe transform themselves into Westerners. They would rather prefer to have investments on the continent than democracy because Africans need food to eat. What would you say about that?
Well, I've never, worked for a government, let alone the U.S. government, so I can't speak for the U.S. government. But as someone who has been working in the democracy space, I would first want all of us to remember that democracy is not an American export. Democracy has got universal values that citizens embrace, and that when you go, even in our villages, in our districts, in regions, in provinces across the continent, there are certain fundamental values that Africans aspire to, that Africans practice. They may not call them democracy, they may not embellish them, or they may not package them with the same level of terminology, but issues such as tolerance, mutual respect, even the way in which some of our societies are organized, where you have chiefs, traditional chiefs, but also who are surrounded by traditional councils, where the chief doesn't make decisions without consulting the councils, where the councils also, or the councillors, when they talk to ordinary citizens, take their demands to the chief. We without even the terminology, our societies are born democratic. We just have to make sure that we can harness those values and aggregate them to also practice them at the level of nation states. Because I think the reason why in some countries we find that struggle and that ambivalence with regards to democracy is this false interpretation that it's a Western concept, but also the fact that we bring our various traditional practices from the smaller units of villages or districts or regions into an agglomerate which is the nation state, which is a combination of multiple traditional practices. And so you take a country such as Nigeria, and you have like 3 major ethnic groups that have different traditions. But once it's now come together as one nation state of Nigeria, how do you go through its traditional practices and harness those that are reinforcing and empowering, while leaving aside those that do not longer conform to today's modern nation state? So for me, democracy is not a foreign concept. And I think that we should start off our conversation by acknowledging that Africans are not waiting for Western countries to come tell them how to govern themselves democratically. African societies are democratic by nature. The aspiration to live in democratic societies is innate in our humanity. When South Africans were fighting to bring an end to apartheid, they didn't wait for the West to come tell them that apartheid was wrong. In fact, at the time, certain Western governments supported the apartheid regime. But South Africans knew that they wanted their freedom. They wanted a democratic, egalitarian society in which every South African's voice would count. And they went out and they fought for it. When our parents and grandparents fought for independence, in fact, they were fighting against Western powers because they understood that independence would give them the freedom to determine what they wanted to do, the freedom to become whoever they wanted to be, the freedom to govern themselves. And those are the elements that constitute real democratic governance. And so with these examples, I hope the message goes out from henceforth that democracy is not a Western concept, that we as human beings have born in us certain values to which we hold dearly, and that even across the African continent, our forefathers organized already in favor of these values, and it is incumbent upon us to fight for them, to make sure that the future generations don't have to fight the fights that we didn't fight, but also that we'll be leaving for the next generation a better, freer, more democratic Africa than the one that we may have inherited, an Africa that allows every human value to be recognized and treated seriously.